The third portion of planning an essay is the thesis. The thesis can be called the main claim, that is, the main idea of the paper. There are four basic types of thesis statements. Your text identifies the informative, when the purpose is to perform and not to persuade. Argumentative, when the purpose is to persuade. The reader may agree or disagree with the position. There is an assertion, a position, and backing. We'll be addressing this type of thesis later. The question or open-ended thesis, the thesis stated in the conclusion. For our purposes, we will be stating the thesis for the essays we write in this class. And finally, the implied. That is when you simply move the reader to consider, and the thesis is not stated. Again, our papers in this class will have a stated thesis statement that is either informative or argumentative. So for this essay, we're writing an informative essay, and so our thesis statement will be informative. You'll recall in the textbook that there is a chart in the chapter on rhetorical situation that lists appropriate verbs. But our next question is how we come up with a thesis statement. And it is, first of all, not the first thing you do. It is the result of a thinking process. You have gone through a brainstorming process or generated ideas by listing or clustering or by free writing. And you are seeking to identify the strongest ideas that you have. And you're seeking to look at relationships between and among those ideas. Once you have formulated those kinds of ideas, you're ready to draft a thesis statement. This can be called a working thesis. It is the controlling idea for the paper that you are writing, or for the paper, in this case, that you're planning. You're not married to the thesis statement. It is something that can change up until the point that you actually submit the paper. The rule is what is stated in the thesis should be reflected in the body of the paper. There is a relationship there that must be maintained. So if your thesis presents certain ideas, but then you realize you want to develop the ideas differently and that you want to add or take away, you certainly can do that. You simply need to revise the thesis to reflect those changes. So we know what the thesis is. It is the main claim of the paper. It tells the reader what the paper is about and what order that information is going to be addressed in the paper. The thesis is not an announcement. We don't start with, I'm going to discuss, or this paper is about. That's a statement of purpose, and you certainly may begin with that, but then you need to move beyond that to draft a thesis statement. It is not a fact. That is, it must be open for debate and discussion. A fact is something that can be easily verified or confirmed. It is not negotiable. So it is not the topic, it is not something that is appropriate for a thesis statement. It's important that our thesis is neither too broad nor too narrow. We don't want something that needs a book-length discussion to address completely, and we certainly don't want something so narrow that we can't get more than a paragraph development out of it. We're going to look at some examples of thesis statements that need to be revised so that they are not these things. This PowerPoint is one that is developed from or by a writer's reference and was published by the textbook company. It provides us examples of thesis statements that are first ineffective and then are revised. The first one is a thesis that is too factual. You can't disagree with it, you can't debate it, and it doesn't need to be developed. You can revise the idea to create something that is a thesis statement. So instead of telling your reader when the polygraph was developed, you can challenge its reliability and discuss what it should or should not be used for. In this case, the thesis is an argumentative thesis. A thesis is not a question. We can ask a question and our answer can be the thesis. In this case, we are speculating. We are considering what Kennedy might have done based on his behavior in the past, that is, prior to his death. So we see here that, again, there is an argumentative thesis that takes a position which will be supported in the paper. The idea of scope is whether the position taken is too broad or too narrow. Mapping the human genome and the implications for it is something that a book could be written about. So you could not discuss all of the implications of mapping the human genome. Instead, look at small parts. Here, the author is going to present the position or present the argument that policy should not allow us to test certain people with genetic predispositions. The idea being what is gained by my knowing that I'm going to probably develop Alzheimer's in 10 years, or that I have a predisposition for a terribly virulent strain of malignancy. So this position would be to argue for policies to govern how we use information. A thesis can also be too narrow. In this case, there's not really an argument in the draft thesis, but we need to consider how we can address it in such a way that we could develop it. So here, the idea of psychological trauma. What would happen to me if I learned that I had a certain genome that was going to affect me? So the author is going to debate the position. Finally, it should be focused and not vague. Notice it says avoid fuzzy, hard-to-define words. Use concrete language. Let your reader know what you're going to talk about. Here, there is a question: how does the physical structure of the memorial shape the experience? And then the answer is the thesis statement. And this would be informative. This would be suggesting to the reader how specifically the Vietnam Veterans Memorial would be experienced by viewers. Your task was, for this assignment, was to have used one or more pre-writing techniques to generate ideas. For another class that was writing a classification and division essay, I went through the process of generating ideas. And so my pre-writing focuses on the kinds of roads that we travel. And to start with, I began to look at what we see when we drive on particular kinds of roads. And I looked at I had chosen 3 types, and I looked at things that we find on the interstate, things that we find on state roads, things that we find on back roads. And I went back then and added in more detail, so that I had some different kinds of sensory details, so that I had things that I could use to develop my ideas. And then I began to draft my thesis statement. Now, this is what I particularly want you to pay attention to. What I did was stop and start when I came to a point that I didn't feel like it was making sense or that it didn't sound right. I just started over. Notice that we have 8 attempts before I had something that I would consider to be my working thesis. Students often think that they need to get it right the first time. If you think that, you're probably going to set yourself up to fail, because that's not typically what happens. You may start with something very simple. There are 3 types of roads we travel. You may start with something a little more complex. Because we travel 3 types of roads, we have different experiences. But I wanted to show the relationship between the kind of road I was driving on and what kind of experience I had. So that's what my ultimate working thesis was. Reaching a destination may mean traveling on one of these particular types of roads. The end result is the same, and the journey, though, will be determined by the type of path I've chosen. So the type of road I choose determines what kind of experience I have. Notice that I have 2 sentences. We usually think of a thesis statement as being 1 sentence. So as I've finished working on my paper, I would want to revise that. Notice that I have talked about interstates, main roads, and back roads in the thesis statement. The expectation of the reader is that I'm going to discuss those things in that order. Again, I can revise. If I want to discuss them in a different order, I simply need to revise the thesis statement to reflect that change. So, the thesis statement is the main claim. It lets the reader know what's going to be discussed in what order. You can go back to the chapter on rhetorical situation to look at specific verbs that are used for informative thesis statements. But based on the generation of ideas, the pre-writing that you did, your task is to develop a thesis statement, to draft a thesis statement that will control the content of the essay that you're planning.